Chapter 8: The United States, Ambivalent Superpower. All 12 post-war American presidents publicly and vigorously proclaimed America's exceptional role in the world. Each took it as an axiom that the United States altruistically seeks to resolve conflicts and establish the equality of all states, with world peace and universal harmony serving as the primary compass and measure of success. All presidents, regardless of party, Democrat or Republican, proclaimed that American principles were applicable to the entire world. This was perhaps most eloquently, though by no means uniquely, expressed by President John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address on January 20, 1961. Kennedy called upon the nation to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. He drew no distinction between threats. He defined no priorities governing America's involvement. Most notably, he emphasized a rejection of the shifting calculations of the traditional balance of power. What Kennedy called for was an effort to create not a new balance of power, but a new world of law. It was to be a grand and global alliance against the common enemies of man. What other countries might have regarded as a rhetorically beautiful phrase was presented in American discourse as a definite program of action on a global scale. Speaking at the UN General Assembly a month after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson reaffirmed the same unconditional global commitment. Any man and any nation that seeks peace and hates war and is willing to fight the good fight against hunger and disease and misery will find the United States of America by their side, willing to walk with them, willing to go with them every step of the way. This sense of responsibility for the world order and the conviction in the indispensability of American power, backed by the consensus rooted in the moral universalism of leaders relying on the American people's devotion to liberty and democracy, led to exceptional achievements during and after the Cold War. America helped rebuild the shattered economies of European countries, created the Atlantic Alliance, and formed a global community for security and economic partnership. It moved from the isolation of China to a policy of cooperation. It developed an open world trade system that ensures efficiency and prosperity and stood, as it has for the past century, at the forefront of almost all technological revolutions. It maintained a policy of direct engagement in governance in both friendly and opposing countries. It played a leading role in formulating new humanitarian principles, and, to fulfill its commitments, has shed American blood in 5 wars and numerous other instances since 1945. No other country has professed such idealism or possessed the resources to respond to such diverse and numerous challenges, nor the capacity to succeed in so many cases. American idealism and exceptionalism were the driving forces in constructing the edifice of the new international order. For several decades, there was a remarkable alignment between America's traditional faith and historical experience and the world in which it found itself. For the generation of leaders who took responsibility for building the post-war order, the two great achievements were overcoming the Depression of the 1930s and defeating aggression in the 1940s. Both tasks required definitive solutions. In the economic sphere, restoring growth and adopting new social welfare programs. In war, the unconditional surrender of the enemy. At the end of the war, the United States, as the only major country to emerge without significant losses, produced about 60% of the world's GNP. This opened the possibility of defining leadership through practical progress modeled on America's domestic achievements, alliances through Wilsonian concepts of collective security, governance through economic recovery programs and democratic reforms. The Cold War was initiated by the U.S. as a defensive measure to protect those countries that shared America's views on world order. It was believed that their adversary, the Soviet Union, had merely strayed from the international community to which it would eventually return. America, following this vision, was destined to clash with other historical views on world order. With the end of the colonial era, countries with different historical experiences and cultures began to appear on the international stage. The nature of communism grew more complex, and its influence became ambiguous. Significant hardships brought to power governments and gave rise to doctrines that rejected American concepts of domestic and international order. Great as American capabilities were, their limitations were becoming apparent. It became urgently necessary to define priorities. America's encounter with these realities raised a new question that the U.S. had not faced before. Is American foreign policy a story with a beginning and an end, where final victories are possible? Or is it a process conditioned by the need to respond to and manage constantly emerging challenges? Does foreign policy have a goal, or is it a process without end? In answering these questions, America had to go through painful and unpleasant debates and overcome internal rifts related to defining the essence of its role in the world. This was the reverse side of historical idealism. By framing the question of America's global role as a test of moral perfection, it subjected itself to harsh criticism for its failures, which at times had a profound impact. Hopes for a final culmination of efforts, a safe, democratic, rules-based world, as Wilson predicted, often squared poorly with expectations of foreign policy as a constant pursuit of possible circumstance-driven goals. Given that almost every president insisted that America acts on universal principles while all other countries pursue only national interests, the United States risked experiencing extremes such as overextension and disillusionment with failure. Since the end of World War II, In the process of seeking its vision of world order, America has entered 5 wars in pursuit of grand objectives. Initially embraced with near unanimous public support, these efforts later saw society sharply divide, often balancing on the brink of violence. In the case of 3 such wars, the establishment's support was suddenly replaced by a readiness to accept a program of virtually unconditional unilateral retreat. 3 times within the span of 2 generations, the United States, changing horses midstream, exited wars in the very midst of hostilities, characterizing them as either failing to achieve transformation, being poorly planned, or insufficiently justified. In the case of Vietnam, this occurred as a result of congressional decisions. In the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, by presidential directive. The victory in the Cold War was accompanied by America's inherent ambivalence. The United States sought to find its spirit in the moral value of its efforts, for which historical parallels are hard to find. Yet, either the goals set by America were unattainable, or America did not follow a strategic line compatible with achieving such goals. Critics would attribute these failures to the moral and intellectual shortcomings of America's leaders. Historians will likely conclude that they stem from the inability to resolve the ambiguity surrounding the relationship between power and diplomacy, realism and idealism, force and legitimacy, the very ambivalence that permeates the entire society. The dawn of the Cold War. Nothing in Harry S. Truman's political career suggested that he would one day become president, much less that he would stand at the origins of creating an international order structure that would endure throughout the Cold War and help bring it to an end. Yet it was he, this exemplar of the typical American, the common man, who was destined to become one of the most productive U.S. presidents. No president faced a more daunting task. The war had ended, yet none of the victorious powers had made any attempt to reformat the world order, as had been the case with the Westphalian settlements of 1648 or the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Thus, Truman's first task was to give concrete form to Roosevelt's idea of a realistic international institution called the United Nations, UN. In the UN Charter, signed in San Francisco in 1945, 2 methods of international decision-making were fused together. The General Assembly was to be an open collective body based on the doctrine of the equality of states, one country, one vote. At the same time, the United Nations was intended to carry out a policy of collective security based on the unanimity of the Security Council, which included 5 great powers as permanent members with veto power: the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. Great Britain, France, and China were included among the permanent members as much out of respect for their significant achievements as in recognition of the role they played at the time. Together with 9 other countries, rotating non-permanent members, the Security Council was endowed with special responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The United Nations would have the opportunity to achieve its goal if the permanent members shared a common vision of the world order. On issues where they disagreed, the World Organization tended to formalize differences rather than mitigate them. The last meeting of the Allied heads of state took place in Potsdam in July-August 1945, where Truman, Winston Churchill, and Stalin defined the borders of the occupation zones in Germany. During the Potsdam Conference, Churchill, having been defeated in the elections, was replaced by Clement Attlee, his wartime deputy. At this meeting, it was also decided that Berlin would come under the joint administration of the 4 victorious powers, with guaranteed access to the Western occupation zones through territory occupied by the Soviet Union. As it turned out, this was the last major agreement between the Allies of World War II. Negotiations to implement the agreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union quickly reached an impasse. The Soviet Union insisted on forming a new international and socio-political structure in Eastern Europe, according to the principle laid down by Stalin in 1945. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. It cannot be otherwise. Rejecting any mention of Westphalian principles in favor of objective factors, Stalin now ruthlessly, albeit crotchety, imposed the Marxist-Leninist system throughout Eastern Europe. The first direct military confrontation between the former wartime allies occurred over the access routes to Berlin, the capital of the defeated enemy. In 1948, in response to the unification of the 3 occupation zones of the Western Allies, Stalin blocked land and water transport links to West Berlin, whose supply, until the end of the blockade, was largely maintained by the American Berlin airlift.
How Stalin analyzed objective factors can be illustrated by my conversation with Andrei Gromyko in 1989. For 28 years, he had been the USSR foreign minister, until Mikhail Gorbachev, upon coming to power, appointed him to the presidency, a high but largely ceremonial office. Therefore, he had plenty of time to discuss the events of Russian history he had witnessed, and could express his opinions without fear. I asked how, given the enormous losses and destruction suffered during the war years, the Soviet Union would have acted in the event of an American military response to the Berlin blockade. Gromyko said that Stalin gave this answer to the questions of his subordinates. He doubted that the United States would use nuclear weapons in the case of a local problem. If the Western Allies had attempted to open access to Berlin with conventional ground forces, the Soviet troops were ordered to resist. For this, they did not need a decision from Stalin. If American troops intended to attack along the entire front, Stalin reserved the right to make the final decision. In other words, Stalin felt strong enough to wage a local war, but would not risk engaging in a global war with the United States. From then on, the two power blocs began to stare each other down, without resolving the problem underlying the crisis. Europe, liberated from Nazism, was in danger of falling under the control of a new hegemonic power. The newly independent countries of Asia, whose socio-political institutions were still unstable, and which experienced deep internal and often ethnic contradictions, might have gained self-government, only to find themselves face-to-face with a doctrine alien to the West and hostile to ideas of pluralism in both domestic and international politics. Truman's strategic choice, the birth of a new hegemony. At this stage, Truman made a strategic choice that became fundamental to American history and the evolution of the international order. He put an end to the historical temptation of going it alone, and through his actions, America became permanently engaged in the ongoing formation of a new international order. He launched a series of critical initiatives. The 1947 Greek-Turkish aid program replaced the subsidies with which Great Britain had supported these key Mediterranean countries, subsidies the British could no longer afford. In 1948, the Marshall Plan was proposed, through which the economic viability of Europe was eventually to be restored. In 1949, Dean Acheson, Secretary of State in the Truman administration, presided over the ceremony marking the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the cornerstone of a new international order under American auspices. NATO became a new starting point in the process of establishing European security. The international order was no longer characterized by a traditional European equilibrium, ultimately determined by the shifting coalitions of numerous states. Rather, whatever balance prevailed was reduced to the one existing between two nuclear superpowers. If one of them were to disappear or abdicate its role, the balance would be lost, and the opponent would dominate. The former occurred in 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The latter was a source of constant fear for America's allies during the Cold War. They feared that the United States might lose interest in defending Europe. The nations united in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization possessed some armed forces, but their presence essentially served as a ticket to take cover under America's nuclear umbrella and could not serve as a tool for local defense. The construct built by America in the Truman era was a unilateral guarantee in the form of a traditional alliance. With the formation of this structure, the debate over the ultimate goal of American foreign policy resurfaced. Were the goals of the new alliance moral or strategic? Coexistence or the exhaustion of the adversary? Did America seek to convert the adversary to the true path or seek its evolution? The logical consequence of conversion would be the requirement that the adversary break with its past in one comprehensive act or gesture. Evolution, on the other hand, implies a gradual process, a willingness to pursue the ultimate foreign policy goal through intermediate stages, and to deal with the adversary as a reality while that process runs its course. Which course did America choose? Reflecting its historical ambivalence, America chose both.
Strategies of order in the Cold War era. The most comprehensive American strategic blueprint for the Cold War was put forward by a then obscure Foreign Service officer, George Kennan, who headed the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Never before had a single diplomatic official so profoundly shaped the debate in the United States regarding America's role in the world. While Washington remained in the euphoria left over from the war years, stemming from a belief in Stalin's goodwill, Kennan predicted an approaching confrontation. As he argued in a 1945 private letter to a colleague, the United States had to recognize the fact that upon the war's conclusion, the USSR would transform from an ally into an adversary.
A basic conflict arises, therefore, in Europe between the interests of Atlantic maritime power, which require the maintenance of an active and independent political life on the European peninsula, and the interests of a jealous Eurasian land power, which must always seek Western expansion, and for which there can never be a safe frontier from its point of view, short of the Atlantic Ocean. Kennan proposed an unequivocally strategic response: to gather immediately into our hands all the cards we hold and begin to play them to the hilt. In Eastern Europe, Kennan concluded, Moscow would dominate. This region was closer to Russian centers of power than to Washington, and sadly, Russian troops had arrived there first. Therefore, the United States should strengthen its sphere of influence in Western Europe, protected by America, with a dividing line running through Germany, and endow this sphere with sufficient strength and cohesion to maintain a geopolitical balance. This prophetic prediction of post-war outcomes was rejected by Kennan's colleague, Charles Chip Bolin, who proceeded from the Wilsonian conviction that, for a democracy, foreign policy of this kind is impermissible. Only totalitarian states can adopt and pursue such a political course. Washington could accept the balance of power as a fact, but it should not be utilized as a policy. In February 1946, the American embassy in Moscow received an inquiry from Washington, asking whether a doctrinaire speech delivered by Stalin signaled a shift in the Soviets' commitment to a harmonious international order. Kennan, at that time the deputy chief of mission, had the opportunity many Foreign Service officers dream of, to present his views directly to the highest level without seeking the ambassador's approval. Kennan responded with a 5-part telegram, totaling 19 single-spaced typewritten pages. The essence of the so-called long telegram was that the entire American discussion of Soviet intentions required a complete rethink. Soviet leaders viewed East-West relations as a competition between opposing concepts of world order. They had taken a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity and grafted it onto a revolutionary doctrine of global scope. The Kremlin would interpret every aspect of international relations in light of the Soviet doctrine of an ongoing struggle for supremacy between two centers of world significance, as Stalin called them, capitalism and communism, whose global rivalry was inevitable and in which there could be only one winner. The leaders of the Soviet Union believed that battle was inevitable and accordingly moved in that direction. The following year, Kennan's position, now as head of the State Department's policy planning staff, became public through an article in Foreign Affairs signed by a certain X. At first glance, the article reaches the same conclusion as the long telegram. Soviet pressure on the West is real and inevitable, but it can be contained by the adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points. Theodore Roosevelt would surely have agreed with such an analysis without difficulty, but in describing his vision of how the conflict might end, Kennan returned to Wilsonian territory. At some stage of Moscow's futile confrontation with the outside world, he predicted, Soviet leaders would feel the need to seek support not just from the party apparatus, but from the broader masses, who are politically immature and inexperienced, as society has not been allowed to develop an independent political sense. But if the unity and efficacy of the party as a political instrument were ever disrupted, then Soviet Russia might be changed overnight from one of the strongest to one of the weakest and most pitiable of national societies. This prediction, essentially correct, was Wilsonian in spirit, based on the conviction that democratic principles would eventually prevail and that legitimacy would transcend power and force. This was precisely the conviction held by Dean Acheson, the seasoned U.S. Secretary of State, who served as a model for many of his successors, including myself. From 1949 to 1953, through NATO, he focused on building what he called situations of strength. East-West diplomacy was to reflect the balance of power more or less automatically. Acheson's successor in the Eisenhower administration, John Foster Dulles, expanded the alliance system through SEATO into Southeast Asia, 1954, and through the Baghdad Pact into the Middle East, 1955. In essence, the policy of containment boiled down to forging military alliances all along the Soviet periphery across two continents. World order consisted of the confrontation between two incomparable superpowers, each organizing international order within its own sphere of influence. Both secretaries of state viewed power and diplomacy as sequential stages. First, America must consolidate its allies and show its strength. Then the Soviet Union would be forced to abandon its claims and come to a reasonable compromise with the non-communist world. However, if diplomacy must rely on military power, why exclude it during the formation of Atlantic relations? And how is the power of the free world to be communicated to the other side? Especially since in reality, America's nuclear monopoly, combined with the devastating consequences of the war for the Soviet Union, guaranteed that even at the start of the Cold War, the actual balance of power was clearly tilted in favor of the West. A situation of strength did not need to be built, it already existed.
The moral crusade versus geopolitical reality. Winston Churchill recognized the situation in a speech delivered in October 1948, arguing that the West's negotiating position would never be stronger than it was at that time. Negotiations should be forced, not suspended. The question is asked, what will happen when they, the Soviets,
get the atomic bomb themselves, and have also accumulated a large store. You can judge for yourselves what will happen then by what is happening now. If these things are done in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? No mind in his senses can believe we have much time left. We ought to bring matters to a head and make a settlement. The Western nations will be far more likely to reach a lasting settlement without bloodshed if they formulate their just demands while they have the atomic power and before the Russian communists have got it too. Undoubtedly, Truman and Atchison believed the risk was too great and resisted comprehensive negotiations out of fear they might undermine Allied cohesion. Moreover, when Churchill called for a decisive battle, at least a diplomatic one, he was the leader of the opposition, not the prime minister. The incumbent, Clement Attlee, and his foreign secretary, Ernest Bevin, opposed plans involving the threat of war. In this situation, the United States assumed leadership of the global effort to contain Soviet expansionism, but did so primarily on moral rather than geopolitical grounds. Valid interests existed in both spheres, but the way they were described usually obscured attempts to define strategic priorities. Even the secret directive NSC 68, which systematized the Truman administration's national security policy and was largely drafted by hardliner Paul Nitze, avoided mentioning national interests and framed the conflict in traditional moral, almost poetic categories. The struggle was between the forces of freedom, which is founded upon law, resulting in the diversity, deep tolerance, and law-abidingness of a free society, where every individual has the opportunity to realize his capacities, and the forces of slavery under the grim oligarchy of the Kremlin. For an America guided by its own system of principles, the Cold War it entered was not a geopolitical rivalry over the limits of Russian power. For America, it was a moral crusade in the name of the free world. In such an undertaking, American policy was presented as an altruistic pursuit of the common interests of humanity. John Foster Dulles, a practical and astute politician in moments of crisis, and a stubborn representative of American power, nevertheless characterized American foreign policy as a kind of global voluntary effort, defined by principles radically different from the approach of any other state in history. He noted that, although many find it difficult to understand, for the United States, the motive is actually other than short-term expediency. From this perspective, America's impact does not restore the geopolitical balance, but transcends it. For centuries, it has been the habit of nations to act only to promote their own immediate interests and to injure their rivals, and it is not easy to accept that a new era can come when nations are guided by principle. The unspoken premise that other countries have selfish interests, while America has principles and destiny, is as old as the Republic itself. What was new was that a geopolitical rivalry in which the United States acted as a leader rather than a bystander was justified primarily from a position of moral values, while the pursuit of American national interests was vehemently denied. This appeal to universal responsibility bolstered America's firm commitment to rebuilding the shattered post-war world and holding the front line against Soviet expansionism. However, when the time came for hot war, open armed conflict, on the periphery of the communist world, such a compass proved to be less than reliable.
The Korean War, a clash of strategies. The Korean War ended in a stalemate, but the controversies it generated foreshadowed the questions that would haunt the country a decade later. In 1945, Korea, formerly a Japanese colony, was liberated by the victorious Allies. The northern half of the Korean peninsula was occupied by the Soviet Union, the southern half by the United States. Before withdrawing their troops, in 1948 and 1949 respectively, the USSR and the USA established their own forms of government in their zones. In June 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea. The Truman administration viewed the event as a classic case of Sino-Soviet aggression, analogous to the actions of Germany and Japan before World War II. Although U.S. armed forces had been significantly reduced in previous years, Truman took the bold step of deciding to resist the attack, primarily with American troops stationed in Japan. Modern research demonstrates that the communist side was driven by mixed motives. When North Korean leader Kim Il-sung sought Stalin's approval before the invasion launched in April 1950, the Soviet dictator supported him. After Tito's defection 2 years prior, Stalin realized that first-generation communist leaders fit poorly into the Soviet system of satellite states, which he considered essential for the national interests of the USSR. Starting with Mao Zedong's visit to Moscow in late 1949, less than 3 months after the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, Stalin felt anxiety regarding China's growing potential, led by a man as power-hungry as Mao.
An invasion of South Korea could distract China, as the crisis arose near its borders, shift America's attention from Europe to Asia, and in any case, force America to spend some of its resources. If Pyongyang's plans for reunification were realized with Soviet assistance, then the Soviet Union would likely secure a dominant position in Korea, and given the deep-rooted historical mutual suspicion of these two countries, form a counterweight to China in Asia. Mao followed Stalin's lead, whose support was almost certainly conveyed to him in exaggerated terms by Kim Il-sung, but for the opposite reason. The Chinese leader feared being encircled by the Soviet Union, whose selfish interests regarding Korea had been no secret for centuries, and became even more evident after Stalin's demands for ideological submission as the price for the Sino-Soviet alliance. A prominent Chinese figure once told me that by letting Stalin draw him into launching the war in Korea, Mao committed the only strategic mistake of his political career, because ultimately the Korean War delayed the unification of China by a century, as close cooperation between America and Taiwan had time to form. Be that as it may, the start of the war in Korea owed far less to a Sino-Soviet conspiracy against America than to a three-way maneuvering for a dominant position within the Communist International Order, with Kim Il-sung constantly raising the stakes to secure support for conquest plans whose global consequences ultimately surprised all the main participants. The complex strategic calculations of the communist leaders did not match the considerations of the American side. In essence, the United States was fighting for a principle by repelling aggression, and the means by which they realized their goal was the United Nations. America was able to obtain UN approval because the Soviet representative, in protest against the exclusion of Communist China from the UN, boycotted the Security Council meeting and was absent for the decisive vote. There was much less clarity regarding the meaning of the phrase repelling aggression. Did it mean unconditional victory? And if something less, then what exactly? In short, how was the war supposed to end? As it happened, life outpaced theory. As a result of General Douglas MacArthur's unexpected landing in Incheon in 1950, the North Korean army found itself trapped in the south and suffered a major defeat. Should the victorious army, having crossed the former dividing line along the 38th parallel, enter North Korea and achieve reunification? If it did so, it would exceed the boundaries of a literal interpretation of collective security principles, because the legal goal of repelling aggression had been achieved. However, what would be the lesson from a geopolitical perspective? If an aggressor has nothing to fear except a return to the status quo ante, is it not likely that similar events would repeat elsewhere? Several alternatives were immediately put forward. For example, to continue the offensive to the narrow neck of the peninsula, a line connecting the cities of Pyongyang and Wonsan, a frontier roughly 150 miles from the Chinese border. This would destroy most of the North's military capabilities, and 9/10 of the North Korean population would be in a unified Korea, but it would still be far enough from the Chinese border.
The Chinese intervention and the Truman-MacArthur dispute. It is now known that long before American planners raised the question of where to halt the advance of their troops, China was already preparing for a possible intervention. As early as July 1950, China concentrated 250,000 soldiers on the Korean border. By August, Chinese strategists based their plans on the assumption that the ongoing North Korean offensive would fail once American troops, qualitatively superior to the North Korean army, were fully deployed. They had accurately predicted MacArthur's surprise landing at Incheon. On August 4, at a time when the front line was far to the south at the Pusan perimeter, Mao stated at a Politburo meeting, "If the American imperialists win, they will grow giddy with success, and then they will be in a position to threaten us. We must help Korea. We must come to their rescue. Help can be given in the form of volunteer units, and we will choose the time to send them, but we must begin preparing." Nevertheless, he told Zhou Enlai that if the United States stopped at the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, Chinese troops would not need to attack immediately. They should wait and conduct intensive training. What might have happened during or after such a halt remains a matter of speculation. For American troops did not stop there. Washington approved MacArthur's crossing of the 38th parallel and set no limits for his offensive, except for the Chinese border. For Mao, the American advance to the border meant that more than just Korea was at stake. At the very beginning of the war, Truman had sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, separating the two sides of the Chinese Civil War. This occurred less than 9 months after the proclamation of the People's Republic of China. If the war resulted in a large American contingent on the Chinese border and a fleet between Taiwan and the mainland, the support for the North Korean invasion would turn into a strategic catastrophe. In the clash between two different concepts of world order, America, proceeding from Westphalian and international legal principles, sought to preserve the status quo. Nothing contradicted Mao's understanding of his revolutionary task more than maintaining the status quo. Chinese history showed that Korea had repeatedly been used as a springboard for invasions of China, and Mao did not forget this. His own revolutionary experience was based on the premise that civil wars end in either victory or defeat, but never a stalemate.
Mao convinced himself that once America established itself on the Yalu River, the next step would be the encirclement of China, with US troops deployed in Vietnam. This was 4 years before the US actually became involved in Indochina. These considerations led Mao to adopt the same strategy used by China's rulers in 1593 against invading Japanese forces. Waging war against a superpower was a daunting task. At least 2 Chinese marshals refused to command the units destined to face American troops. But Mao was persistent, and the unexpected Chinese offensive drove American forces back from the Yalu River. However, after China's intervention, what was the goal of the war? These questions sparked a heated debate in America. MacArthur stubbornly held the traditional view. The goal of war is victory, to be achieved by all necessary means, including airstrikes on China itself. A stalemate is a strategic failure. The Truman administration responded in 2 ways. First, demonstrating civilian control over the military, President Truman dismissed MacArthur on April 11, 1951. Substantively, Truman emphasized containment. The main threat was the Soviet Union, whose goal was dominance in Europe. Expanding the war into China would be, in the words of General Omar Bradley, the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy.
The Korean stalemate, 2 concepts of negotiation. A few months later, in June 1951, the front line stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, where the war had begun, just as it had happened half a millennium earlier. At this point, the Chinese proposed negotiations, and the United States accepted. 2 years later, an agreement was reached, which, at the time of this writing, has endured for over 60 years, despite brief periods of tension. In the negotiations, as in the origins of the war, 2 distinct strategic approaches confronted each other. The Truman administration proceeded from the American view of the relationship between power and legitimacy. According to this view, war and peace are separate phases of policy. When negotiations begin, the application of force ceases and diplomacy takes over. Each activity has its own rules. Force is necessary to bring the parties to the table, but thereafter it is superfluous. The outcome of negotiations depends on an atmosphere of goodwill, which military pressure would destroy. Consequently, American troops were ordered to limit themselves primarily to defensive actions during the talks, and not to undertake large-scale offensive operations. The Chinese attitude toward negotiations was the exact opposite. War and peace are 2 sides of the same coin. Negotiations are a continuation of the battle. As the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, the most important contest is psychological. One must influence the enemy's plans and undermine his confidence in success. The adversary's de-escalation of hostilities is perceived not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a sign of weakness to be exploited by increasing one's own military advantage. The communist side used the resulting stalemate to fuel the American public's anxiety over an inconclusive war. In fact, America suffered as many casualties during the negotiation phase as it did during the offensive phase of the war. Ultimately, each side achieved its goal. America upheld the doctrine of containment and preserved the territorial integrity of an ally that has since become one of Asia's leading nations. China proved its determination to defend the approaches to its borders and demonstrated its disdain for international rules, in whose drafting it had played no part. The result was a draw. However, it exposed a potential vulnerability in America's ability to link strategy with diplomacy, power with legitimacy, and to define essential goals. Korea ultimately drew the line. It was the first war where America explicitly renounced victory as a goal, foreshadowing what was to come. As it turned out, the Soviet Union lost the most. It had supported the initial decision to invade and had to bear the consequences, largely by supplying and equipping its allies. However, it lost their trust. It was during the Korean War that the seeds of the Sino-Soviet split were sown, as the Soviets insisted on payment for their logistical aid and refused to provide troop support. The war also triggered a rapid and massive U.S. rearmament, which immediately restored uncertainty in Western Europe by creating a situation of strength, the indispensable condition of the American doctrine of containment. Each side experienced failure. Some Chinese historians believe the country lost the opportunity to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, supporting instead an unreliable ally. The United States lost both the aura of invincibility it had earned after World War II and, to some extent, its sense of direction. Other revolutionaries learned the lesson that if America could be drawn into an inconclusive war, there was a chance to undermine the American public's willingness to support it. In terms of strategy and international order, a gap emerged in the American public consciousness, one that would become glaringly evident in the jungles of Vietnam.
Vietnam and the crisis of national consensus. Even amidst the troubles of the Korean War, The combination of Wilsonian principles and Rooseveltian geostrategy provided a remarkable impetus that sustained the first decade and a half of Cold War policy. Despite the onset of domestic political debates, America organized the Berlin Airlift of 1948-1949, thwarting the Soviet ultimatum on West Berlin, endured the Korean War, and repelled the Soviet attempt in 1962 to station medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba. This was followed in 1963 by the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty with the Soviet Union, which became a symbol of the superpowers' need to discuss and limit their capacity to destroy humanity. In Congress, a bipartisan consensus largely existed regarding the policy of containment. Relationships between policymakers and intellectual communities were professional and ostensibly based on shared long-term goals. However, the national consensus began to unravel, coinciding, roughly, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. One reason for the rift was the shock that gripped the nation after the murder of the young president, who had called on America to embody its idealistic traditions. Although the crime was committed by Oswald, a communist who had lived for a time in the Soviet Union, the heavy loss led many of the younger generation to question the moral validity of the American way. The Cold War began with a call to support democracy and freedom worldwide, a call repeated by Kennedy with even greater passion in his inaugural address. Yet, over time, the military doctrines fueling the containment strategy began to have a corrosive effect on public perception. The gap between the destructive capacity of weapons and the goals for which they could be used proved insurmountable. All theories of the limited application of nuclear technology demonstrated their unfeasibility. The strategy adopted for implementation was based on the ability to inflict such damage that civilian casualties would be deemed unacceptable, yet losses on both sides would inevitably total tens of millions within days. Such calculations took a toll on the self-confidence of national leaders and undermined public trust in them. Furthermore, the policy of containment, when transposed to the fringes of Asia, had to be conducted under conditions entirely opposite to those in Europe. The Marshall Plan and the creation of NATO were successful because a political tradition of governance had survived in Europe even if temporarily interrupted. Economic recovery could revive political vitality. However, in most underdeveloped countries, political structures were fragile or newly emergent, and economic aid led to corruption as often as it promoted stability. Such dilemmas arose during the Vietnam War. To combat South Vietnamese guerrillas, Truman sent civilian advisors in 1951. In 1954, Eisenhower added military advisors. In 1962, Kennedy authorized the dispatch of regular U.S. combat units as support elements. In 1965, Johnson deployed expeditionary forces, whose numbers eventually grew to over 500,000. The Kennedy administration was on the brink of involvement, and for the Johnson administration, waging war was already on the agenda, driven by the conviction that the North Vietnamese attack on South Vietnam was the start of a Sino-Soviet offensive aimed at world domination. In defending Asia, America intended to act just as it had in Western Europe. According to President Eisenhower's domino theory, the loss of one country to communist control would trigger the sequential fall of others. This theory utilized the containment doctrine to thwart an aggressor, modeled on NATO, and a program of economic and political reconstruction, as with the Marshall Plan. At the same time, to avoid expanding the war, the United States refrained from striking sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, from which Hanoi's troops launched attacks and to which they retreated to evade pursuit. None of the administrations bothered to propose a plan for ending the war that provided for anything other than preserving South Vietnamese independence, destroying the forces deployed by Hanoi to topple the regime, and massive bombings of North Vietnam intended to force Hanoi to reconsider his policy of conquest and sit at the negotiating table. Such a program was not considered unusual or controversial until the middle of Johnson's second term. Then, a wave of protests and media criticism, culminating after the 1968 Tet Offensive, which was a crushing military defeat for North Vietnam, but presented by the Western press as a stunning victory and evidence of American failure, struck a sensitive nerve in the soul of the administration.
The Vietnam trauma and the collapse of the establishment. Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore and perhaps the wisest Asian leader of his time, openly expressed a firm conviction, and he had not altered his position by the time of this writing, that American intervention was essential to preserve the possibility of an independent Southeast Asia. The analysis of the regional consequences of a communist victory in Vietnam was largely correct. However, by the time of full-scale U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, Sino-Soviet unity no longer existed. Relations between these countries experienced a visible crisis throughout the 1960s. China, devastated by the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, increasingly viewed the Soviet Union as a dangerous and threatening adversary. The containment principles used in Europe proved far less applicable in Asia.
Instability in Europe arose when the war-induced economic crisis threatened to undermine traditional domestic political institutions. In Southeast Asia, after a century of colonization, such institutions had yet to be created, especially in South Vietnam, which historically had never existed as a state. America attempted to fill the gap by launching, simultaneously with the military effort, a campaign of nation-building. While fighting North Vietnamese regulars with traditional means and Viet Cong guerrillas in the jungles, America enthusiastically undertook political construction in a region that for centuries had known no self-government and never democracy. After a series of coups, the first of which, in November 1963, effectively received approval from the American embassy and silent consent from the White House in the hope that military rule would be more effective than liberal institutions, General Nguyen Van Thieu became the president of South Vietnam. At the start of the Cold War, a government's non-communist orientation was perceived perhaps too broadly as proof that it was worth preserving to counter Soviet designs. Now, in the emerging atmosphere of mutual recrimination, South Vietnam's inability to emerge as a fully functioning democracy in the midst of a bloody civil war led to sharp condemnation. A war that had initially been supported by a significant majority and had grown in scale through the efforts of a president citing universal principles of freedom and human rights was now condemned as evidence of exceptional American moral folly. There was no shortage of accusations of immorality and deception. The favored adjective became barbaric. American involvement was characterized as a form of madness, revealing profound flaws in the American way of life. Accusations of wanton civilian killings became commonplace. The bitter controversy surrounding the Vietnam War left one of the deepest and most painful scars in American history. The administration that drew America into Indochina was composed of decent people of extraordinary intelligence, who suddenly found themselves accused of almost criminal stupidity and conscious deception. What began as a reasonable discussion about feasibility and strategy turned into street demonstrations, denunciations, and violence. Critics were right to point out that American strategy, particularly in the early stages, was ill-suited to the realities of asymmetric conflict. Bombings followed by pauses to test Hanoi's willingness to negotiate usually led to a stalemate. America applied enough force to provoke condemnation and resistance, but not enough to compel the adversary to negotiate seriously. The dilemmas generated by Vietnam were largely a consequence of academic theories of gradual escalation that had sustained the Cold War. While conceptually consistent in a confrontation between nuclear superpowers, such theories were far less suitable for an asymmetric conflict where the adversary pursues a guerrilla strategy. Certain hopes for the link between economic reform and political evolution proved unrealizable in Asia, but these questions could have been the subject of serious discussion, rather than a reason for vilification and attacks on university and government buildings, as occurred during the most extremist manifestations of the protest movement. The collapse of high aspirations shattered the confidence without which the establishment could not find its footing. Leaders who had previously supported American foreign policy were particularly stung by the fierce student protests. The uncertainty of the older generation turned the dissatisfaction typical of maturing youth into institutionalized anger and national trauma. The demonstrations reached such proportions that in his final year in office, President Johnson, who continued to describe the war in traditional terms of defending free people against advancing totalitarianism, was forced to limit public appearances and speak primarily at military bases. Within months of the conclusion of Johnson's presidency in 1969, a number of the war's key architects publicly renounced their positions and called for an end to military operations and the start of a withdrawal of American troops. These themes were developed until the establishment settled on a end the war program that envisioned a unilateral withdrawal of American troops in exchange for nothing more than the return of prisoners. Richard Nixon became president when 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, on the other side of the globe, and that number was only increasing according to the schedule approved by the previous Johnson administration. From the start of the campaign, Nixon promised to end the war, but he also felt it was his duty to end it in the context of America's global obligations to maintain the post-war world order. Nixon took office 5 months after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, at a time when the Soviet Union was producing ICBMs at a rate that threatened American deterrent forces. Some even spoke of potential Soviet missile superiority. China, meanwhile, remained steadfastly and defiantly hostile. America could not abandon its security commitments in one part of the world without creating difficulties for solving such problems in others. An integral part of Nixon's design remained the preservation of America's credibility as a reliable defender of allies and the global system of order, the very role the United States had played for 2 decades.
The end of the Vietnam War and the loss of the guiding thread. Nixon carried out the withdrawal of American troops at a rate of 150,000 men per year, and by 1971, he had ended U.S. participation in ground combat operations. He authorized negotiations on one indispensable condition. He would never accept a demand that the peace process begin with the replacement of the South Vietnamese government, America's ally, by a so-called coalition government, which in reality would be composed of figures nominated by Hanoi. This American position was categorically rejected for 4 years, until finally, in 1972, a failed North Vietnamese offensive, repelled without the help of U.S. ground troops, forced Hanoi to agree to a ceasefire and a political settlement it had resolutely refused for years.
In the United States, the main theme of the debate was a widespread desire to end the trauma inflicted by the war on the population of Indochina, as if America were the sole cause of its suffering. Nevertheless, Hanoi insisted on continuing hostilities, not because it doubted America's desire for peace, but because it expected to exhaust America and undermine the willingness of Americans to sustain casualties. Waging psychological warfare, North Vietnam ruthlessly exploited America's search for compromise in its own interests and sought dominance. In this regard, as it turned out, there were no disagreements in Hanoi. The military operations ordered by President Nixon, which I supported as National Security Advisor, coupled with a policy of diplomatic flexibility, led to the 1973 settlement. The Nixon administration was convinced that Saigon could handle minor violations of the agreement on its own, that the United States would provide air and naval assistance if the North Vietnamese launched an all-out assault, and that over time, the South Vietnamese government, with American economic aid, would succeed in building a functioning society and evolving toward more transparent power institutions, as had happened in South Korea. Whether this process could have been accelerated, and whether America's reliability as an ally could have been defined differently, will remain a subject of heated debate. The main obstacle was the difficulty the American side experienced in understanding how Hanoi thought and made decisions. The Johnson administration overestimated the impact of American military power. Contrary to popular belief, the Nixon administration overestimated the possibilities of negotiation. For the battle-hardened Vietnamese leaders in Hanoi, who had fought for victory their entire lives, compromise was indistinguishable from defeat, and a pluralistic society was virtually inconceivable. Analysis of this debate lies beyond the scope of this book. For all participants, it proved to be a very painful process. Nixon managed to achieve a full withdrawal of troops and a settlement that he believed gave South Vietnam a decent opportunity to determine its own destiny. But after 10 years of controversy and in a very tense post-Watergate atmosphere, Congress in 1973 severely restricted aid to the South Vietnamese and cut it off entirely in 1975. North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam by sending almost its entire army across the internationally recognized border. The international community remained silent, and Congress prohibited American military intervention. Soon after communist insurgencies, the governments of Laos and Cambodia fell, and in Cambodia the Khmer Rouge indulged in almost unimaginable brutality. America lost its first war, and with it the guiding thread of its concept of world order.
Richard Nixon and the International Order. After the bloody 1960s, marked by high-profile assassinations, civil unrest, and inconclusive wars, Richard Nixon inherited in 1969 the task of restoring both the unity of the American political body and the coherence and validity of U.S. foreign policy. Highly intelligent, yet possessed of an insecurity one would not expect to find in so seasoned a public politician, Nixon was not the ideal leader to restore domestic peace. It must also be remembered that the tactics of mass demonstrations, intimidation, and civil disobedience, as the extreme manifestation of peaceful protest, were well established by the time Nixon took the oath of office on January 20, 1969. Nevertheless, for the task of redefining the substance of American foreign policy, Nixon was remarkably well prepared. As a senator from California, vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a perennial presidential candidate, he had traveled extensively. Foreign leaders encountered by Nixon tended to refrain from personal confrontation and engaged him in substantive dialogue, in which he appeared at his best. Since nature had endowed Nixon with a penchant for solitude, he had much more free time than the typical political aspirant, and found that reading suited his temperament. He read widely, and this combination of qualities made him the most foreign policy literate president to take office since Theodore Roosevelt. Since Theodore Roosevelt, no president had addressed the issue of international order as a global concept on such a systematic and conceptual basis. In a conversation with editors of Time in 1971, Nixon articulated the following idea. In his view, the world would operate through 5 major centers of political and economic power, based on an informal commitment by each side to pursue its interests with a certain degree of restraint. The result of their interlocking aspirations and self-restraint would be an equilibrium. We must remember that the only time in the history of the world that we have had any extended periods of peace is when there has been a balance of power. It is when one nation becomes infinitely more powerful in relation to its potential competitor that the danger of war arises. So I believe in a world in which the United States is powerful. I think it will be a safer world and a better world if we have a strong, healthy United States, Europe, Soviet Union, China, Japan, each balancing the other, not playing one against the other, an even balance. What is remarkable about this exposition is that 2 of the countries named in this concert of powers were effectively adversaries of the United States. America was engaged in the Cold War with the USSR, and it had only just resumed diplomatic contact with China after a 2-decade hiatus, during which the US maintained no embassy or official diplomatic relations. Theodore Roosevelt had formulated the idea of a world order in which the United States stood as the guardian of global equilibrium. Nixon went further, arguing that the US should be an integral part of an ever-changing fluid balance,
not as a balancer, but as a constituent element of the system. The passage also demonstrates Nixon's tactical skill, specifically when he denied any intention of playing one part of the balance against another. It is an elegant way to warn a potential adversary, by renouncing a capability the other side knows exists and which remains unchanged by the disclaimer. Nixon made these remarks as he prepared to travel to Beijing. His visit signaled a significant improvement in relations between the two countries, the first time a sitting U.S. president had visited China. To position China as a counterweight to the Soviet Union, occupying a position where America was closer to both communist giants than they were to each other, was exactly the design of the strategy being implemented. In February 1971, Nixon's annual report on foreign policy referred to China as the People's Republic of China, the first time such a degree of recognition was granted in an official American document, and stated that the United States was prepared to establish a dialogue with Peking on the basis of national interest. A related observation regarding China's domestic situation was made by Nixon in July 1971, while I was en route to China on the so-called secret trip. Addressing an audience in Kansas City, Nixon stated that China's internal problems, referring to the Cultural Revolution, should not be viewed with any sense of satisfaction that it will always be that way, because when we see the Chinese as a people, and I have met many Chinese in my travels around the world, they are a creative, hard-working people, one of the most capable peoples in the world, and 800 million Chinese are inevitably going to become an enormous economic power, with all that means in terms of what they might be in other areas if they move in that direction.
Continuation: Nixon's geopolitics and the opening of China. These words, commonplace today, were revolutionary at the time. Since they were delivered extemporaneously and I was out of touch with Washington, my attention was drawn to them by none other than Zhou Enlai when I commenced the first dialogue with Beijing in over 20 years. Nixon, an inveterate anti-communist, had decided that the imperatives of geopolitical equilibrium were far more important than the requirements of ideological purity, a view that, by happenstance, was shared by his counterparts in China. In the 1972 presidential campaign, Nixon's opponent, George McGovern, ran on the caustic slogan, "Come home, America." Nixon responded to the effect that if America evaded its responsibilities on the international stage, things would surely not be right at home. He declared that only if we act greatly in meeting our responsibilities abroad will we remain a great nation, and only if we remain a great nation will we act greatly in meeting our challenges at home. At the same time, he sought to curb our instinctive sense that we knew what was best for others, which in turn led them to be tempted to rely on our prescriptions. To this end, Nixon introduced the practice of annual reports on the state of the world. The drafting of these reports, like all other presidential documents, was handled by the White House staff, in this case by the National Security Council staff under my direction. However, Nixon set the overall strategic tone of these documents and reviewed the text upon completion. These annual reports served as guidelines for government agencies involved in foreign policy and, more importantly, indicated a strategic direction for American policy to foreign nations. Nixon was enough of a realist to emphasize that the United States could not entrust its fate to the goodwill of other countries, not entirely, nor even to a significant degree. As highlighted in his 1970 report, achieving peace requires a willingness to negotiate and a search for new forms of partnership. But this alone is insufficient. The second element of a durable peace must be American strength. Peace, we have learned, cannot be achieved by goodwill alone. He believed that a constant demonstration of American power and a proven readiness to act on a global scale, reminiscent of Theodore Roosevelt's decision to send the Great White Fleet on its world cruise in 1907-1909, would assist rather than hinder the cause of peace. Nor could the United States expect other nations to leave their own futures to chance by basing their foreign policies primarily on the goodwill of others. The guiding principle was the effort to shape an international order that links power with legitimacy, in the sense that all major participants in such an arrangement would consider it just. All nations, adversaries and friends alike, must have a vital stake in the preservation of the international system. They must feel that their principles are respected and their national interests secured. If the international environment meets their vital interests, they will work to maintain it. It was this vision of such an international order that provided the first step towards the opening of China, which Nixon viewed as an indispensable element of that order. One aspect of the opening of China was an attempt to transcend the domestic strife of the previous decade. Nixon became president of a country experiencing deep shock from internal and international upheavals and an inconclusive war. It was vital to present the nation with a vision of peace and international justice,
to inspire the country with dreams worthy of its history and moral values.
Equally important was the redefinition of the American concept of world order. The normalization of America's relationship with China would increasingly isolate the Soviet Union or compel it toward improved relations with the United States. As long as the U.S. could maintain a closer relationship with each of the communist powers than they had with each other, the specter of a joint Sino-Soviet effort for world hegemony, a ghost that had haunted American foreign policy for 2 decades, could be laid to rest. In time, the Soviet Union proved unable to sustain this insoluble, largely self-inflicted dilemma of facing enemies in both Europe and Asia, including within its own ideological camp. Nixon's attempt to make American idealism practical and to give American pragmatism a long-term perspective was attacked from both sides, reflecting the American ambivalence between power and principle. Idealists criticized Nixon for conducting a foreign policy based on geopolitical principles. Conservatives challenged his actions on the grounds that easing tensions with the Soviet Union represented some form of concession to the communist challenge to Western civilization. Both sets of critics seem to forget that Nixon ensured the strength of defenses along the entire Soviet periphery, that he was the first American president to visit Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Romania, symbolically challenging Soviet control, and that he led the United States through a series of crises with the Soviet Union, twice in October 1970 and October 1973, putting U.S. forces on alert without flinching. Nixon displayed extraordinary skill in the geopolitical aspect of building a world order. He patiently linked the various components of strategy and demonstrated exceptional courage in confronting crises and great persistence in pursuing long-term foreign policy goals. One of his frequently repeated maxims was, "You pay the same price for doing something halfway as for doing it all the way, so you might as well do it all the way." As a result, within an 18-month period in 1972-1973, Nixon ended the Vietnam War, opened China, held a summit meeting with the Soviet Union, even while expanding America's military efforts in response to the North Vietnamese offensive, managed to bring Egypt, previously a Soviet ally, into close cooperation with the United States, and secured 2 disengagement agreements in the Middle East, the first between Israel and Egypt, the second with Syria. The latter agreement remains in effect even as this book is being written, despite a brutal civil war. He also initiated the European Security Conference, the results of which, in the long run, seriously weakened Soviet control over Eastern Europe. But at the moment when tactical success might have been transformed into a permanent concept of world order, weaving together an inspiring vision with a real equilibrium, tragedy struck. The Vietnam War had exhausted the energy of both sides. Watergate, which did immense damage to the administration and was ruthlessly exploited by Nixon's long-standing critics, paralyzed the executive branch. In the normal course of events, the various strands of Nixon's policy would have been woven together into a new long-term U.S. strategy. Nixon was permitted a glimpse of the promised land where hope and reality would meet. The end of the Cold War, a redefinition of the Atlantic Alliance's tasks, a genuine partnership with China, a major step towards peace in the Middle East, and the beginning of Russia's reintegration into the international order. But he lacked the time to bring geopolitical vision and opportunity together. It fell to others to complete the journey.
The beginning of renewal. After the agonizing 1960s and the erosion of presidential authority, America's primary need was the restoration of unity. It may be considered a stroke of luck that the man called upon to address this unprecedented task was Gerald Ford. Elevated to a high office for which he had never aspired, Ford had never been entangled in the complex machinations of presidential politics. For this reason, free from an obsession with focus groups and public relations, he was able to discharge the duties of the presidency by drawing upon the moral values of goodwill and faith in his country in which he had been raised. Ford's many years of experience in the House of Representatives, where he sat on key subcommittees for defense policy and intelligence, allowed him to navigate foreign policy tasks and challenges with ease. Ford's historical service lay in overcoming the divisions within America. In foreign policy, he sought, and largely succeeded, to link power with principle. His administration witnessed the signing of the first agreement between Israel and an Arab state, in this case Egypt, the provisions of which were largely political. The Second Sinai Disengagement Agreement marked a definitive turn in Egyptian policy toward a peaceful settlement. Ford initiated active diplomatic efforts aimed at realizing majority rule in southern Africa, becoming the first American president to state this so explicitly. Despite intense domestic opposition,
he attended the signing of the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Among the many articles of this document were clauses that established human rights as a principle of European security. Subsequently, these provisions were utilized by such heroic figures as Lech Walesa in Poland and Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, who sought to bring democracy to their countries and begin the dismantling of communism. At President Ford's funeral, I prefaced my remarks with these words: "According to an ancient tradition, God preserves humanity, despite all its many sins, because at any given time there are 10 righteous men who, unaware of their role, redeem the guilt of mankind. Gerald Ford was such a man." Jimmy Carter became president as the impact of America's defeat in Indochina began to transform into challenges that would have been unthinkable when America still possessed an aura of invincibility. Iran, previously a pillar of the regional Middle Eastern order, fell into the hands of a group of ayatollahs who, in effect, declared political and ideological war on the United States. This overturned the established balance of power in the Middle East. The symbol of this shift was the siege of the American diplomatic mission in Tehran, which lasted over 400 days. At roughly the same time, the Soviet Union felt confident enough to undertake the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Amidst this turmoil, Carter found the moral strength to guide the Middle East peace process, which culminated in the signing ceremony at the White House. The peace treaty between Israel and Egypt was a historical event. Although its origins lay in the elimination of Soviet influence and the launch of the peace process, the credit for which belongs to previous administrations, the conclusion of the treaty under Carter was the culmination of persistent and determined diplomacy. Carter solidified the opening of China by establishing full-scale diplomatic relations, consolidating a bipartisan consensus regarding the new policy. He also reacted sharply to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan by providing support to those resisting the Soviet occupation. During a very difficult and painful period, Carter reaffirmed the United States' commitment to moral values and human dignity inherent in America's self-image, even as he experienced hesitation toward the end of his term, when faced with the new strategic task of finding the proper balance between power and legitimacy.
Rarely has America produced a president so attuned to the spirit of the times and so prepared to address the pressing tasks at hand as Ronald Reagan. A decade earlier, Reagan might have appeared too bellicose to be a realist. A decade later, his convictions might have seemed too one-dimensional. But confronting a Soviet Union whose economy was stagnating and whose gerontocratic leaders were quite literally dying in succession, and backed by an American public opinion ready to move past years of disillusionment, Reagan unified America's latent and sometimes seemingly discordant strengths: idealism, resilience, creative energy, and economic vitality. Sensing the potential weakness of the Soviets and being convinced at his core of the superiority of the American system, he had studied far more works on American political philosophy than his homegrown critics presumed. Reagan combined the two elements, power and legitimacy, that had fueled American ambivalence in the preceding decade. He challenged the Soviet Union by drawing it into an arms and technology race it could not win. To this end, the president launched programs that Congress had long blocked. What became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, a shield against missile strikes, was in many ways ridiculed by Congress and the media when Reagan first proposed his plan. Today, however, the program is largely credited with convincing the Soviet leadership of the futility of attempting to compete in an arms race with the United States. At the same time, Reagan provided a psychological impetus to policy by making bold pronouncements on the very edge of Wilsonian moralism. Perhaps the most moving example is Reagan's farewell address, delivered as he left office in 1989. He described his vision of America as a shining city on a hill. "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it, and see it still." For Reagan, America as a shining city on a hill was not a metaphor at all. For him, the city actually existed because Reagan willed it to exist. This was a major distinction between Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, whose policies were quite similar and frequently coincided. Nixon treated foreign policy as a series of energetic, unending efforts, a set of rhythms to be managed. He dealt with their complexities and inconsistencies like homework assignments set by an especially demanding teacher. Nixon hoped America would prevail, but believed it would be a long and joyless road, perhaps concluding only after he had left office. In contrast,
Reagan summarized his Cold War strategy with a characteristically optimistic maxim shared with an aide in 1977. We win, they lose. The style in which Nixon conducted his course was essential for restoring mobility to Cold War diplomacy. Reagan's style was necessary for the diplomacy of ending the Cold War. On one hand, Reagan's rhetoric, including his March 1983 speech referring to the USSR as an evil empire, could have signaled an end to any prospects for East-West diplomacy. On a deeper level, however, this approach symbolized a transition period in which the Soviet Union gradually realized the futility of the arms race, while its aging leadership struggled with the problem of succession. Cloaking complexity in a veneer of simplicity, Reagan also put forward the idea of reconciliation with the Soviet Union, going much further in his thoughts on a settlement than Nixon had ever been prepared to articulate. Reagan was convinced that communist intransigence was based more on ignorance than on ill will, on misunderstanding rather than hostility. Unlike Nixon, who believed that by appealing to self-interest one could achieve a compromise between the United States and the Soviet Union, Reagan believed the conflict would likely end with a realization of the superiority of American principles. In 1984, after the appointment of the veteran Communist Party official Konstantin Chernenko as the top Soviet leader, Reagan confided to his diary, "I have a gut feeling I'd like to talk to him about our problems man to man and see if I could convince him. I think the Soviets would gain materially if they joined the family of nations, etc." When Mikhail Gorbachev replaced Chernenko a year later, Reagan's optimism only grew. He told his associates that he dreamed of taking the new Soviet leader on a tour to show him a neighborhood where the American working class lived. As one of Reagan's biographers recalled, the president imagined how, quote, the helicopter would descend and Reagan would invite Gorbachev to knock on doors and ask the residents of the town what they thought of our system, and the workers would tell him how wonderful it was to live in America. All of this would convince the Soviet Union to join the global movement toward democracy, which in turn would lead to peace, because, quote, governments that rest upon the consent of the governed do not wage war on their neighbors, a fundamental principle defining the Wilsonian view of international order.
Reagan's vision and the transition to the post-Cold War era. Reagan decided to apply his concept to the issue of nuclear arms control, and at the 1986 Reykjavik summit, he proposed to Gorbachev the elimination of all nuclear delivery systems while maintaining and expanding missile defense systems. This would have achieved one of Reagan's frequently stated goals, to eliminate the very possibility of nuclear war by removing the necessary offensive potential and constraining any violator of the agreement with missile defense systems. Such an idea did not fit within Gorbachev's conceptual framework, which is why he bargained so vigorously over a secondary proviso to limit missile defense testing to laboratory conditions. In any case, the proposal to eliminate nuclear delivery vehicles was impracticable, as it was vehemently opposed by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and French President François Mitterrand, both convinced that Europe could not be defended without nuclear weapons and viewing their independent deterrence as the ultimate insurance. Many years later, I asked the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin why the Soviets had not offered some compromise on the testing issue. He replied, because it never occurred to us that Reagan might simply walk out of the negotiations. Gorbachev sought to counter Reagan's ideas with a concept of Soviet reform. But by the 1980s, the balance of power, to which Soviet leaders had tirelessly referred for decades, had turned against them. An unworkable economic model proved unable to sustain 4 decades of imperial expansion in all directions. The United States, despite all its disagreements and hesitations, preserved the essential elements of a position of strength. Over 2 generations, an informal anti-Soviet coalition of all leading industrial centers and much of the developing world had been constructed. Gorbachev realized that the Soviet Union could not sustain its course toward dominance, yet he underestimated the fragility of the Soviet system. His calls for reform, the policies of glasnost and perestroika, unleashed forces that were too disorganized for genuine reform and too demoralized for the Soviet Union to remain a totalitarian leader, much as Kennan had predicted half a century earlier. Reagan's idealistic commitment to democracy alone could not have produced such a result. Vigorous defensive and economic policies, a perceptive analysis of Soviet weaknesses, and extraordinarily favorable international circumstances all played a role in the success of his chosen course. Nevertheless, without Reagan's idealism, at times bordering on a detachment from history, the Soviet challenge would not have ended in an atmosphere of global affirmation of a democratic future. 40 years ago and for decades thereafter, it was believed that the primary obstacle to establishing a world order safe for all was the Soviet Union. It followed logically that after the fall of communism, which if it were to happen at all seemed a prospect for the remote future, an era of stability and goodwill would prevail. It soon became clear that history generally deals in much longer cycles. Before a new world order could be established, it was necessary to deal with the shards of the Cold War. That task fell to George Herbert Walker Bush,
who managed to accept America's predominant role in the world with moderation and wisdom. Born into an aristocratic family and raised in Connecticut, he chose to make his fortune in Texas, a part of the United States known for simpler manners and greater entrepreneurship. Having a rich and varied experience in government at various positions and all levels, George H.W. Bush guided the country with extraordinary skill through a stunning series of crises that tested both America's practical application of its moral values and the limits of its vast power. Within months of taking office, the Tiananmen Square protests in China challenged not only America's fundamental values, but also the importance of maintaining the U.S.-China relationship for the global balance. Drawing on his experience as head of the U.S. Liaison Office in the PRC, having served in Beijing even before official diplomatic relationships were established, Bush acted in a way that remained true to American principles, while preserving the prospects for further cooperation with China. He proved himself an adept diplomat during the reunification of Germany, previously considered a likely cause for war, when he chose not to exploit the Soviet Union's difficulties as its empire collapsed. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Bush, following the same reasoning, rejected all suggestions to fly to Berlin to celebrate this demonstration of the collapse of Soviet policy. The dexterity with which Bush the Elder brought the Cold War to a conclusion overshadowed the domestic debate through which United States efforts had been sustained, and which helped define the tasks of the next stage. As the Cold War neared its end, American society leaned toward a consensus that the primary work of bringing the former adversary to the righteous path had been accomplished. Henceforth, an international order aimed at peace and security would be established, provided that democratic nations took care to assist the final wave of democratic transformations in states still under authoritarian rule. Wilson's ultimate dream would be fulfilled. Free political and economic institutions would spread, and antiquated antagonisms would eventually vanish, falling before the onslaught of tolerance and harmony.
From the Commonwealth of Freedom to the challenge of jihadism. It was in this spirit that Bush repelled the Iraqi attack on Kuwait during the First Gulf War, assembling through the UN a coalition of nations ready to counter the aggressor, the first joint operation involving the major powers since the Korean War. He halted military operations when the objectives defined by UN resolutions were achieved. Perhaps, as a former U.S. representative to the UN, he sought to heed the lesson learned by General MacArthur, who, after the victory at Incheon, decided to cross the demarcation line between North and South Korea. For a brief time, it seemed that the global consensus formed in 1991 after the liberation of Kuwait, which had been seized by Saddam Hussein's forces, confirmed the perennial American hope for a rules-based international order. In November 1990 in Prague, Bush called for a commonwealth of freedom, guided by law. It was to be a moral community, united by its members' devotion to the ideals of free men. Membership in this commonwealth was open to all. Someday it might be universal. The great and growing strength of the Commonwealth of Freedom would eventually forge for all nations a new world order, far more stable and secure than any we have known. The United States and its allies would move from containment to a policy of active engagement. Bush's tenure was cut short by his defeat in the 1992 presidential election, in part because he campaigned as a foreign policy president, while his opponent, Bill Clinton, appealed to a war-weary audience by promising to focus on the domestic issues of the American agenda. However, the newly elected president soon announced a resumption of an active foreign policy along a course comparable to Bush's. Clinton expressed confidence in the dawn of a new era when, in his 1993 address to the UN General Assembly, he characterized his foreign policy concept not as containment, but as enlargement. Our overriding purpose, he proclaimed, must be to expand and strengthen the world community of market-based democracies. From this perspective, since the principles of political and economic freedom are universal, from Poland to Eritrea, from Guatemala to South Korea, their spread would not require the use of force. Describing an initiative in line with inevitable historical evolution, Clinton assured that American policy would strive for a world of thriving democracies that cooperate with each other and live in peace. When Secretary of State Warren Christopher attempted to apply the theory of democratic enlargement to the People's Republic of China by making economic ties conditional on the reform of China's domestic political system, he met with a sharp rebuff. Chinese leaders insisted that relations with the United States could be built only on a geostrategic basis, not on the pace of China's progress toward political liberalization, as had been proposed. By the third year of his presidency, Clinton in practice returned to a less assertive approach regarding the world order. Meanwhile, the concept of democratic enlargement encountered a far more belligerent adversary. Jihadism sought to spread its message and attacked Western values and institutions, especially those related to the United States, viewing them as the primary obstacle to the revival of Islam. Months before Clinton's address to the General Assembly, an international group of extremists, including one U.S. citizen, detonated a bomb at the World Trade Center in New York.
A secondary target for the terrorists, had their original plan failed, was the UN Secretariat building. Since the Westphalian concept of the state and international law is based on rules not explicitly established by the Quran, it represented a godless abomination to this movement. Similar objections were raised against democracy, as it allows for the passage of laws separate from Sharia. America, in the view of jihadist forces, acted as an oppressor of Muslims seeking to fulfill their own worldwide mission. Their challenge culminated in an open attack. On September 11, 2001, strikes were carried out against New York and Washington. At least in the Middle East, the end of the Cold War heralded not a welcome era of democratic consensus, but a new epoch of ideological and military confrontation. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. 3 decades after the painful debate over the lessons of Vietnam, equally serious problems arose in connection with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Both conflicts were caused by a violation of the international order. For America, both ended in retreat and the withdrawal of troops.
Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, which in 1998 had issued a fatwa calling for the indiscriminate killing of Americans and Jews worldwide, found sanctuary in Afghanistan, a country then under the rule of the Taliban. The Afghan authorities refused to extradite the organization's leaders and militants. America's response to the attack on its home soil was inevitable and was met with understanding nearly everywhere in the world. Almost immediately, a new problem arose: how to establish international order when the primary enemies are non-state organizations that do not seek to defend any specific territory and which reject established principles of legality. The war in Afghanistan began in an atmosphere of national unanimity and international consensus. The prospects for establishing a rules-based international order seemed well-founded when NATO, for the first time in its history, invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which stipulates that an armed attack against one or more NATO allies in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. 9 days after the September 11th attacks, U.S. President George W. Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban authorities then harboring al-Qaeda. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land. Give the United States full access to terrorist training camps so we can make sure they are no longer operating. When the Taliban failed to meet these demands, the United States and its allies launched a war, the objectives of which Bush described on October 7th in similarly concise terms. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. Early warnings that Afghanistan would prove to be a graveyard of empires, a recurring theme in the country's history, appeared unfounded at first. Following swift actions led by American, British, and allied Afghan forces, the Taliban was removed from power. In December 2001, at an international conference in Bonn, Germany, the creation of an interim Afghan government headed by Hamid Karzai was announced, along with the start of a process to convene a Loya Jirga, a traditional tribal council, to form and approve post-war Afghan institutions. It seemed the Allies' military objectives had been achieved. The negotiators in Bonn optimistically declared an impressive vision: the establishment of a broad-based, gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, and fully representative government. In 2003, a UN Security Council resolution authorized the expansion of the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, to support the Afghan Transitional Authority and its successors in the maintenance of security in areas of Afghanistan outside of Kabul and its environs, so that the Afghan authorities as well as the personnel of the United Nations can operate in a secure environment. The core premise of the American and Allied efforts became the reconstruction of Afghanistan through a democratic, pluralistic, and honest Afghan government, whose mandates would be carried out across the entire country, supported by an Afghan national army capable of assuming responsibility for security at the national level. It was a striking idealism, yet such efforts were considered comparable to the democratic nation-building in Germany and Japan after World War II.
The challenge of Afghan statehood. No institution in the entire history of Afghanistan, or any of its regions, could offer a precedent for undertaking such broad-based efforts. Traditionally, Afghanistan has been less a state in the conventional sense, and more a geographic designation for a territory that has never been under the consistent administration of any single entity. For most of the country's history, Afghan tribes and religious sects existed in a state of mutual warfare, uniting only briefly to resist an invasion or to conduct predatory raids on neighbors. The elites in Kabul could occasionally afford to experiment with parliamentary institutions, but beyond the capital, an ancient tribal code of honor prevailed. The consolidation of Afghanistan occurred only inadvertently, caused by foreigners, when tribes and sects formed a coalition to oppose an invader. Thus, what confronted American and NATO forces at the beginning of the 21st century was essentially little different from the scene witnessed in 1897 by a young Winston Churchill. Except at harvest time, when self-preservation dictates a temporary truce, the Pathan, Pashtun,
Tribes are always engaged in private or public war. Every man is a warrior, a politician, and a theologian. Every house is a feudal fortress. Every family cherishes its vendetta. Every clan its hereditary feud. Nothing is ever forgotten, and very few profits are ever let pass. In such a context, the establishment of an honest and democratic central Afghan government operating in a secure environment, the proclaimed goal of the coalition and the UN, was tantamount to a radical reimagining of Afghanistan's entire historical structure. The resulting government effectively elevated one clan above others, the Pashtun Popalzai clan, to which Hamid Karzai himself belongs, and sought to assert its authority throughout the country through force, either its own or the coalition's, through the distribution of foreign aid, or by both means. Inevitably, the efforts required to implant such institutions disregarded centuries-old privileges, unsettling a mosaic of tribal alliances in a way that is almost impossible for any external power to control. The 2008 U.S. elections exacerbated the difficulties caused by America's ambivalent approach. During his campaign, the new President Barack Obama declared that he would return to the necessary war in Afghanistan by utilizing troops withdrawn from the stupid war in Iraq, which he intended to end. But upon taking office, he became determined to shift the focus to non-military transformation and domestic challenges. The result was a revival of the ambivalence characteristic of American military campaigns since World War II. The announcement of 30,000 additional troops as reinforcements was accompanied by a simultaneous public declaration that the withdrawal of American forces would begin in 18 months. As was later argued, the specific timeline was publicized intentionally to serve as an incentive for the Karzai government to work more energetically on building a modern central government and to accelerate the formation of an army to replace American units. However, the goal of a guerrilla strategy such as that waged by the Taliban is to outlast the defending forces. For the leadership in Kabul, the announcement of a fixed date for loss of external support became the starting point for fractional maneuvers, including those involving the Taliban.
The progress achieved during this period in Afghanistan was significant and hard-won. The population embraced elective institutions, showing considerable courage as the Taliban continues to threaten death to those participating in democratic structures. The United States, having set the goal of locating and eliminating Osama bin Laden, also succeeded, sending a loud and clear message. America is always determined to avenge atrocities, and there is no hiding from its retribution. However, it remains difficult to say anything definitive about the region's prospects. Following the withdrawal of American troops, which was inevitable at the time of writing, the authority of the Afghan government will likely extend to Kabul and its environments, but it is doubtful that decrees from the capital will be followed in the rest of the country. More likely, a confederation of semi-autonomous feudal regions will emerge along ethnic lines, influenced by competing foreign powers. The problem will return to its starting point: the compatibility of an independent Afghanistan with the regional political order. Afghanistan's neighbors should be no less interested than the United States, and ultimately much more so, in an Afghanistan that is unified, peaceful, and free from jihadist influence. This is in their national interest. If Afghanistan returns to its former state, a base for jihadist non-state organizations, or a country pursuing jihadist policies, it would pose a risk of upheaval within the borders of all its neighbors, primarily for Pakistan, due to its internal structure, then for Russia, given its Muslim populations in the south and west, and for China, because of the significant Muslim population in Xinjiang. Instability would even threaten Iran, where fundamentalist Sunnis hold influence. From a strategic perspective, all these countries are more threatened by an Afghanistan that supports terrorism than by the United States, except perhaps Iran, which might assume, as in the cases of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, that chaos beyond its borders allows for the manipulation of rival groups. Ironically, it is possible that war-torn Afghanistan could serve as a prime example of whether it is possible to free a regional order from the influence of divergent security interests and historical perspectives. Without a viable international security program for Afghanistan, each major neighbor will support one of the rival factions divided by ancient ethnic and religious barriers. The likely outcome would be a de facto partition of the country, Pakistan controlling the Pashtun South, while India, Russia, and perhaps China support the ethnically diverse North. To avoid a power vacuum, substantial diplomatic efforts are required to define a regional order in the event Afghanistan reemerges as a center of jihadism. In the 19th century, the great powers acted as guarantors of Belgian neutrality, and those guarantees lasted for 100 years. Is some equivalent of this possible, with appropriate redefinitions in the case of Afghanistan? If such a concept or a similar one cannot be formulated, Afghanistan will likely pull the world back into perpetual war.
Iraq. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush formulated a global strategy to counter jihadist extremism and strengthened the established international order by including a commitment to democratic transformation. The great battles of the 20th century, asserted the national security strategy prepared by the White House in 2002, demonstrated that there exists a single sustainable model for national success: freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. At present, the national security strategy pointed out, we have witnessed the world shaken by the unprecedented atrocity of terrorists, and the great world powers stand on the same side, united by common dangers of terrorist violence and chaos. Promoting the spread of the institutions of freedom and cooperative relationships among the leading nations offer the best chance since the rise of the nation-state in the 17th century to build a world where great powers compete in peace instead of continually preparing for war. The centerpiece of what became known as the Freedom Agenda was to be the transformation of Iraq, one of the most repressive states in the Middle East, into a multi-party democracy, which in turn would spur the entire region toward democratic change. Iraqi democracy will succeed, and that success will send forth the news, from Damascus to Tehran, that freedom can be the future of every nation. The Freedom Agenda was not, as was later claimed, an arbitrary invention of a single president in his circle. Its core premise was an evolution of a characteristically American theme. The 2002 National Security Strategy, which first announced this policy course, echoed the provisions of the NSS 68 Memorandum, which in 1950 had defined America's mission in the Cold War, albeit with one crucial distinction. In 1950, that document placed American moral values in defense of the free world. The 2002 strategy, however, set the task of eliminating tyranny throughout the world, relying on the universal values of freedom. UN Security Council Resolution 687 of 1991 demanded that Iraq destroy all stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction and mandated the cessation of all programs to develop such weapons. Since then, 10 Security Council resolutions had found Iraq in material breach. Regarding the military effort in Iraq, the decision to conduct what was essentially a police action as an implementation of one aspect of the project to spread freedom and democracy became characteristic and traditional for America. To the rising tide of radical Islamic universalism, America responded with a new reaffirmation of the universality of its moral values and its concept of world order. A fundamental condition was significant socio-political support, especially regarding the removal of Saddam Hussein from power. In 1998, the U.S. Congress passed the Iraq Liberation Act with overwhelming bipartisan support, 360 votes to 38 in the House of Representatives, and passed unanimously in the Senate. It stated that it should be the policy of the United States to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq and to promote a democratic government to replace that regime. Upon signing the act on October 31, the same day it passed the Senate, President Clinton expressed agreement with both parties. The United States wants Iraq to rejoin the family of nations as a freedom-loving and law-abiding member. This is in our interest and that of our allies within the region. The United States offers support to opposition groups from all sectors of Iraqi society that could lead to a popularly supported government. Since no political parties were permitted in Iraq except for the ruling Ba'ath Party, which Saddam Hussein ruled with an iron fist, and consequently no formal opposition parties existed, the president's phrasing had to mean that the United States intended to develop a covert program to overthrow the Iraqi dictator.
The Freedom Agenda and the realities of Iraq. Following the military intervention in Iraq, Bush expanded the idea of broader engagement, declaring it in November 2003 in a speech delivered on the 20th anniversary of the National Endowment for Democracy. Bush condemned past U.S. policy in the region for seeking stability at the expense of liberty. 60 years of Western nations excusing and accommodating the lack of freedom in the Middle East did nothing to make us safe, because in the long run, stability cannot be purchased at the expense of liberty. In the changed conditions of the 21st century, the approaches of traditional politics promised unacceptable risks. Therefore, the administration was moving from a policy of stability to a forward strategy of freedom in the Middle East. American experience in Europe and Asia had shown that the advance of freedom leads to peace. I supported the decision to effect regime change in Iraq. I had doubts regarding the extension of this decision to nation-building and its conversion into such a comprehensive undertaking, and I voiced them in public and governmental forums. But before setting forth my observations, I wish to express here my lasting respect and personal affection for President George W. Bush, who led America in turbulent times with courage, dignity, and steadfast faith. The goals he set and his dedication did honor to the country, even when, in a number of instances, they proved unattainable within the limits of the American political cycle. It is a symbol of his commitment to the Freedom Agenda
to which Bush, since leaving the presidency, now devotes his energy and time, and which he has made the central theme of his presidential library in Dallas. From my own childhood years, I know what a member of a discriminated minority experiences in a totalitarian system, and later as an immigrant in the United States, I have first-hand knowledge of those aspects of American values related to liberation from various social constraints. Spreading these values through example and civic support, as in the cases of the Marshall Plan and economic aid programs, is a noble and important part of the American tradition. But to implant such values through military occupation in a part of the world where they had no historical roots, and to expect fundamental change within a politically significant time frame, the standards set by many supporters and critics of the efforts in Iraq are often very similar, is a task that, as it turned out, lies beyond what the American public is prepared to sustain and what Iraqi society can accommodate. If one takes into account the ethnic contradictions in Iraq and the millennium-old conflict between Sunnis and Shiites, a dividing line that ran through the center of Baghdad, then the attempt to transform a historical legacy under combat conditions, and moreover, at a time when domestic political debates only breed division, gives the American effort in Iraq some resemblance to the labor of Sisyphus. These difficulties are exacerbated by the resolute opposition to such transformations from regimes in neighboring countries. Without achieving success, the efforts are ultimately destined to remain endless.
The sectarian divide and the surge. The establishment of a pluralistic democracy intended to replace the brutal rule of Saddam Hussein proved to be a far more complex undertaking than the overthrow of the dictator itself. The Shiites, long disenfranchised and embittered by decades of Hussein's oppression, generally identified democracy with the assertion of their numerical majoritarianism. The Sunnis viewed democracy as a foreign conspiracy aimed at their suppression. Accordingly, most Sunnis boycotted the 2004 elections, which were intended to play a vital role in defining the post-war constitutional order. The Kurds in the north, remembering well Baghdad's bloody massacres, strengthened their own military capabilities and made efforts to establish control over oil fields to secure revenues independent of the state treasury. They defined their autonomy in terms that differ by an infinitesimal amount, if they differ at all, from national independence. Passions already inflamed by the atmosphere of revolution and foreign occupation flared with renewed intensity after 2003, fueled by outside powers pursuing their own interests, Iran, which supported Shiite factions, undermining the independence of the emerging government, Syria, which facilitated the transfer of arms and jihadists across its territory, ultimately with devastating consequences for its own integrity, and Al-Qaeda, which launched a campaign of systematic slaughter against the Shiites. Each community increasingly viewed the post-war order as a zero-sum struggle for power, territory, and oil revenues. In such an atmosphere, the bold decision taken by Bush in January 2007 to deploy a surge of troop reinforcements intended to quell the wave of violence was met with a non-binding resolution of disapproval supported by 246 members of the House of Representatives. Although it failed in the Senate due to procedural reasons, 56 senators opposed sending reinforcements. The Senate majority leaders soon declared that this war is lost and the surge is not accomplishing anything. In the same month, the House and Senate passed a bill authorizing the start of the withdrawal of American troops within a year, which the president vetoed. As reported, Bush closed a 2007 planning session with the question, "If we're not there to win, why are we there?" This remark captured the president's resolute character, as well as the tragedy of a country whose people for more than half-century had been prepared to send their sons and daughters to remote corners of the world to defend freedom, but whose political system is unable to unite behind an equally single and unwavering purpose. While the surge of reinforcements, boldly ordered by Bush and brilliantly led by General David Petraeus, successfully fought for an honorable exit from a looming collapse, America's mood in this regard changed. Barack Obama became the Democratic presidential candidate, in part because he steadfastly opposed the Iraq War. Upon taking office, he continued to publicly criticize his predecessor and implemented an exit strategy with more emphasis on the exit than on the strategy. At the time of this writing, Iraq serves as the main battlefield for the religious rivalry unfolding in the region. Its government leans toward Iran. Part of the Sunni population is in armed opposition to the government.
Both sides of the sectarian divide provide support to rival jihadist forces in Syria, and across half the country, the terrorist group ISIS is attempting to build a caliphate. The issue goes beyond political debates about the past. The entrenchment in the heart of the Arab world of a jihadist organization that possesses significant stockpiles of mostly captured weapons and military equipment, as well as militants from various countries, and which has entered into a religious war with radical Iranian groups and Iraqi Shiite formations, requires a concerted and convincing international response. Otherwise, it will metastasize even further. Consistent strategic efforts are required from both the United States and other permanent members of the Security Council, and perhaps from the regional adversaries of this group.
Purpose and possibility. The nature of international order was called into question when, as a challenge to the Westphalian system of states, the Soviet Union emerged. Looking back over several decades, one can debate whether the balance America sought was always optimal. However, it is difficult to deny that in a world possessed of weapons of mass destruction and experiencing political and social upheavals, the United States preserved the peace, helped restore the vitality of Europe, and provided essential economic assistance to developing nations. It was in the conduct of hot wars that America found it difficult to relate purpose to possibility. In only one of the 5 wars America has fought since World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the First Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan, namely the First Gulf War during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, did America achieve its stated objectives without triggering sharp domestic political divisions. The question of when the outcome of other conflicts, ranging from stalemate to unilateral withdrawal, becomes predetermined is a subject for another discussion. For our purposes, it is sufficient to say that a country that plays an indispensable role in the search for world order must undertake that task while being at peace with its role and with itself. The essence of historical events is rarely evident to those who witness them. The Iraq War can be viewed as a catalyst for broader transformations in the region, the fundamental nature of which is still unknown and depends on the long-term results of the Arab Spring, the resolution of the nuclear issue and the geopolitical challenge of Iran, and the jihadist assaults on Iraq and Syria. The introduction of elective politics in Iraq in 2004 almost certainly influenced demands for participatory institutions in other countries in the region. It remains to be seen whether these can be reconciled with a spirit of tolerance and peaceful compromise. As America examines the lessons of the wars it has fought in the 21st century, it is important to remember that no other leading power has pursued its strategic initiatives with such a deep-seated desire to improve the lives of humanity. There is a special quality to a nation that proclaims its war aims to be not only the punishment of enemies, but also the improvement of people's lives, seeking victory not to dominate, but to share the fruits of freedom. America would be untrue to itself if it abandoned its inherent idealism. By rejecting such a cherished part of its national experience, it can convince no friends, nor can it conquer any adversary. But for an effective policy, such aspirations must operate alongside an unsentimental analysis of underlying factors, including the cultural and geopolitical configurations of other regions, the loyalties and unities, and the resources of adversaries opposed to American interests and spiritual values. America's moral aspirations must be combined with an approach that accounts for the strategic element of policy, in terms that the American people can support and sustain across several political cycles. Former Secretary of State George Shultz spoke wisely of America's characteristic ambivalence in policy. Americans, being a moral people, want their foreign policy to reflect the moral values we uphold as a nation. But Americans, being a practical people, also want their foreign policy to be effective. Internal American debates are often characterized as a contest between idealism and realism. It may turn out, for America and the rest of the world, that unless America can be both, it will not be able to be either.